The humid summer air, thick with the scent of honeysuckle and damp earth, after a recent shower, kissed Abigail's face as she stepped out of the bustling office building. A sigh, deep and genuine, escaped her lips. Finally, vacation. It had been 2 long years since she'd seen the promise of a true break. 2 years her kind, if somewhat insistent, boss had gently persuaded her to postpone. And for Abigail, the postponement had been a welcome reprieve, a shield against the quiet emptiness of a home that, until recently, had overflowed with laughter and life. Her mind drifted back to the unexpected whirlwind that had been Andrew. Their first meeting had been as unlikely as a snowflake in July, right there on a sun-drenched city sidewalk. Abigail, a grounded woman of 32, had always prided herself on her sensible nature, certainly not one to strike up conversations with strangers. But Andrew, a spirited 26 with a twinkle in his hazel eyes and a laughter that seemed to bubble up from his very soul, had been different. He had followed her, playfully, all the way to her brownstone, his witty banter leaving a spell that had her biting back smiles, determined to maintain her dignified composure. Yet as she reached her front door, a giggle, light and unrestrained, finally spilled out. Andrew's playful grin instantly softened into something earnest. "For me, making such a wonderfully serious woman laugh," he declared, his voice a warm baritone. "You are absolutely obligated to join me for coffee, or maybe an art exhibit, or honestly anywhere, as long as it's with me." Abigail couldn't help but smile, a genuine dimpling curve of her lips. She had never received such an audacious yet utterly charming invitation. "I don't go anywhere with men I don't know," she countered, a hint of playful challenge in her tone. Andrew straightened, clicking his worn sneakers together like a soldier at attention. "Andrew Watson," he announced with a mock salute, 26 years old, happily single, and I possess a perfectly adequate apartment and a respectable career as a landscape architect." Abigail chuckled, the sound like wind chimes in the breeze. "Abigail," she finally replied, "tomorrow at 5 at Rosemary Cafe." With a final knowing glance, she slipped into her building, peeking through the peephole just in time to see Andrew practically skipping down the street, leaping over a park bench with unbridled joy. Their connection had blossomed with the swiftness of spring wildflowers. Within 3 weeks he was driving her out to meet his mother. "Where are we headed?" Abigail remembered asking, her heart fluttering with a mix of excitement and nerves. "Not far," he'd replied, a mischievous glint in his eye. "Just about 20 miles, to my mum's place in the countryside." He had always referred to his mother's sprawling property as the Beast. Abigail had burst out laughing. Why the Beast? Andrew had lowered his voice, affecting a theatrical growl. "Because every spring and every autumn, and sometimes even in the heart of summer, a terrifying monster awakens there. It devours all my strength and all my free time. Its name, Abigail, is the vegetable garden." Abigail had dissolved into another fit of laughter, picturing his exaggerated look of profound agony. His mother, Reese Vance, had been everything Abigail had hoped for and more. A woman with kind eyes and a welcoming smile, Reese had instantly endeared herself, and the feeling was clearly mutual. "Oh, Abigail, my dear," Reese had beamed, embracing her warmly. "I'm so truly delighted. Andrew is a wonderful boy, and he's such a free spirit, so wonderfully unburdened by seriousness. I only hope you can be a good influence on him." "Oh, Mrs. Vance," Abigail had reassured her, "he's only that way on the surface. Deep down, he's incredibly thoughtful and truly steadfast. 3 months after that first sidewalk encounter, they were exchanging vows in a quaint little chapel surrounded by loved ones. Their wedding had been a joyful, lively affair, and life with Andrew was never dull. Even arguments were impossible. He possessed an uncanny ability to disarm any complaint with a well-timed joke, only revisiting the actual issue once Abigail had calmed down. They sold his cosy studio apartment and her charming 1-bedroom, pooling their resources to buy a spacious 3-bedroom house on the edge of town, a place perfect for building a life together. Abigail had always told Andrew that one day Reese would tire of wrestling with her garden and want to move closer. So one of the spare bedrooms was always affectionately known as Reese's room, a place awaiting her arrival. But now, after Andrew's passing, Reese had found solace and purpose in her small town, refusing to get to the city. Abigail stopped abruptly on the tree-lined sidewalk, the memory pulling her up short. It had been more than 2 weeks since she'd last called Reese, and far longer since she'd made the 20-mile drive out to visit. She'd promised Andrew in those final heartbreaking days that she would look after his mother, that she would help her. Lately, Reese had been acting strangely, almost distant, as if trying to push Abigail away. But on Abigail's last visit, the reason had become achingly clear. "Abigail, darling," Reese had pleaded, her voice thick with unshed tears. "Please don't keep coming all this way. You're wrong. You'll find love again, a new life. What am I to you now?" Abigail had stomped her foot, a rare display of exasperation. "What do you mean? What are you to me now?" she'd insisted, her voice trembling. "You're like a mother to me, Reese. It makes no difference whether Andrew is here or not." They had cried together for a long time that day, Abigail nearly missing her train back home. Now, with determination, Abigail made her way back home, gathered a few essential items, and stopped at the local bakery for a box of cinnamon swirls and lemon poppy seed muffins, Reese's favourites. Soon she was on the quiet commuter train heading out of the city. The other passengers were subdued, lost in their own thoughts or the quiet hum of the journey, and Abigail closed her eyes. It had only been a year since she had been able to even think of Andrew without spiralling into a wave of raw, gut-wrenching grief. Andrew had died in a motorcycle accident. He'd never even had a license, nor had he known how to truly ride, but his best friend Mark had just bought a vintage Harley, and Andrew, with his impulsive spirit, had been instantly captivated. Abigail didn't know all the details, not truly, but Mark had recounted how he'd simply shown Andrew the gears, a quick lesson, before Andrew, with a dismissive wave of his hand, had said he'd figure it out. Then, for some inexplicable reason, he'd swerved onto the busy interstate barely a minute later. Abigail made it to the hospital while Andrew was still clinging to life, his eyes so full of mischievous light, now serious, fixed on her. "Forgive me, my love," he whispered, his voice barely a breath. "Forgive me for leaving you, but please don't abandon my mother." And that was it. She couldn't even form a word in response. Andrew's eyes, those beautiful, expressive windows to his soul, became fixed, clouded over like the gaze of a porcelain doll. Abigail screamed, a primal sound of anguish, and after that she remembered nothing. Reese, with a strength Abigail marvelled at, held herself together until Andrew was laid to rest in the quiet green cemetery. But then the grief finally broke her. She collapsed, both physically and spiritually. Abigail nursed her, spoon-feeding her, coaxing her to swallow, gently but firmly insisting she get out of bed. She stayed by Reese's side, a silent sentinel of care, until the older woman could manage on her own again. Only then did Abigail return to the city, to her quiet, empty house. She crumpled in the entryway, the silence pressing in, and sobbed a deep, guttural cry that echoed the 3 years of Andrew's absence. She tried to visit Reese as often as she could, but her work, her challenging, absorbing career as a marketing executive, became her sanctuary. She'd throw herself into projects, taking on extra hours, anything to avoid the quiet emptiness of home. Stepping on the commuter train now, Abigail offered a small, weary smile. It was always so beautiful here, especially in the heart of summer. A million scents, pine needles and damp earth, wild mint and sun-baked grass. A million sounds of chirping crickets and rustling leaves, enveloping her in a gentle embrace. She hoisted her canvas tote bag higher on her shoulder and started down the winding lane towards the small, welcoming cluster of homes. The garden gate, usually secured with a neatly latched hook, swung slightly ajar. Strange. Reese was a woman of meticulous habits, if not outright fastidiousness. Nothing was ever left undone, nothing out of place. And then Abigail's gaze fell upon the front door. A padlock, a heavy one, hung conspicuously from the handle. Abigail stopped, bewildered. How could this be? She had checked the schedule, calculated the days. Had Reese perhaps just run to the market, forgetting to secure the gate in her haste? Abigail stared at the door, her confusion mounting, and it was then she finally noticed the small, creased piece of paper tucked under the brass knocker. She carefully pulled it free, and there, scrawled in an almost childish hand, were a few wobbling words. "Gone to the pharmacy. Be back soon. Please wait." Abigail's lips curved into a small, relieved smile. Well, that explained it. Everything, that is, except for the strangely childish handwriting. She settled onto the old wooden porch swing, the familiar creak a comforting sound, and waited. Less than half an hour passed before a whirlwind of energy burst through the gate. A little girl, no older than 5 or 6, skipped into the yard. Seeing Abigail, her eyes widened with a mix of curiosity and a surprising hint of authority. "Are you here from the health clinic?" she chirped, tilting her head. "Hello." Abigail was taken aback. "From clinic?" she stammered. "Who are you?" The little girl looked at her, clearly surprised by Abigail's confusion. "I'm Sophie, and if you're not from the clinic, then what are you doing here?" "I'm Abigail," she replied, a gentle smile returning. "I've come to visit Reese." The girl, Sophie, regarded her thoughtfully. "Abigail, I see. Well, you've come for nothing. Grandma Reese is sick." "All right then, open the door." A prickle of irritation began to surface in Abigail. This child was taking far too much upon herself. Sophie shrugged, unlatched the padlock, opened the door and walked inside. "Grandma L, we have a visitor." Abigail's breath hitched. Grandma L. Reese lay on the sofa, pale and alarmingly thin. "Abigail, darling, why didn't you call?" Reese's voice was reedy. Abigail looked at her, a knot forming in her stomach. "I wanted to surprise you, Reese. Why didn't you call? Why didn't you tell me?" "I didn't want to bother you," Reese murmured, her gaze distant. "You have your own life, your own responsibilities, and Sophie and I are managing just fine." "And Sophie?" Abigail asked, her voice barely a whisper. Reese sighed, her eyes finally meeting Abigail's. "I suppose it's time I told you. You'll find out eventually." Abigail stared at her mother-in-law, a strange premonition twisting in her gut. What other secrets were there? Secrets she knew nothing about. Sophie is Andrew's daughter. Abigail felt the whole world tilt on its axis. What? You see, he never knew, and neither did I, not until recently. Years ago, before you, Andrew was so young. He met a girl who was visiting relatives for the summer. Things happened between them, as they do when you're young and impulsive. They had a falling out and she left. Andrew was angry, convinced they were simply incompatible, and she never returned to town after that. But then quite recently she brought Sophie here. She told me she was getting married and she didn't want another man's child around. She thought Andrew was still alive, you see. So I insisted she leave Sophie with me, and then I got sick. Abigail's mind reeled. Andrew's daughter. For years she and Andrew had tried to conceive, with no success. Abigail had often wondered, in her moments of quiet longing, what her life would have been like if she'd had a child, a tangible piece of Andrew to hold on to. And now, here was a daughter, fully grown, right before her eyes. A daughter to whom she had no biological connection whatsoever. You didn't tell me, didn't call, Abigail said, her voice laced with a tremor of hurt. Why, Reese? Am I such a stranger to you? The older woman struggled to sit up. No, not at all. It's not because of that. You are so good, so incredibly responsible. I knew you would immediately take on this burden, and you would completely forget about yourself. But I want what's best for you to find happiness again, to remarry. Abigail rose from the swing, her gaze steady on Reese. What if I don't want to remarry? What if I'm happier with you than I ever would be in another marriage? Maybe someday I will, though I truly doubt it. But what then? Will you push me away? When I talk with you, it feels like I'm closer to Andrew. Tears welled in Abigail's eyes, a wave of profound sadness washing over her. This whole situation felt so incredibly raw, and now this child. A small hand gently touched her arm. Don't cry, you're grown up. How about we have some lunch instead? Abigail looked down, surprised, at Sophie, who stood beside her, a gentle smile on her face. I made soup this morning. You? Yourself? Reese chuckled from the sofa, a weak but genuine sound. Sophie can do anything. I'm surprised every day. The soup, a simple vegetable broth, was surprisingly delicious. Abigail ate, offering genuine praise. My goodness, this is wonderful. What else can you cook, Sophie? Sophie's cheeks flushed with pride. I can make pancakes, but oatmeal never turns out right. Abigail laughed, a warm, clear sound. Don't you worry, I'll teach you. Reese managed 2 spoonfuls of soup before settling back onto the sofa. Now tell me what's been happening with you, Abigail urged, her concern deepening. Reese sighed. Oh, nothing much, just my age and my blood pressure. The doctor was quite stern. He insisted I go to the hospital, but how could I? Sophie would be all alone. Abigail nodded, a sombre realization dawning on her. I thought as much. Do you have the doctor's number? Reese looked at her with a flicker of anxiety. Yes, but why do you need it? Because I do, Abigail stated, gently but firmly. Abigail, I can't leave the child. Reese, I'm on vacation, Abigail countered, her voice softening with purpose. So, Sophie and I will stay here, and you'll go get better. Or what? Do you intend to lie here indefinitely? Sophie, who had been listening intently, piped up. Grandma, you should go. You promised to take me mushroom hunting in the fall and show me where they grow. Reese seemed flustered, caught between their wishes. Abigail, dear, but... Abigail rose. "The conversation is over. I'm calling the doctor." For the first few days, Sophie and Abigail spoke very little. Abigail's mind wrestled with the unexpected twist of fate. It felt unfair in a way, yet Andrew hadn't deceived her. This had all happened long before she entered his life, and he hadn't even known himself. And Sophie, sweet Sophie, was utterly blameless. Abigail shuddered to imagine the turmoil in the child's heart, the sudden crushing realization that her own mother no longer wanted her. One sunny afternoon, Abigail stepped into the backyard, pushing open the squeaky gate that led to Reese's beloved garden. She gasped. Never had Reese's tidy rows of vegetables been so overgrown, so choked with weeds. Reese, a woman who treated her garden with the reverence of a sacred space, always kept it pristine. Sophie appeared at her side, kneeling down with earnest determination. "I'll help too. Just show me what not to pull." "Grandma showed me a little bit, but I think I forgot." They worked, in companionable silence at first. Then slowly words began to flow. Sophie recounted how she had barely lived with her mother at all, spending most of her life shuttling between a different grandmother and various aunts. "Mum offered to leave me with them," Sophie confided, her voice small, "but they all said they didn't have time." Abigail's throat tightened. How could anyone be so heartless? "Grandma Reese is good," Sophie continued, her voice growing wistful, "but she's old. I heard her talking to the neighbour, saying they wouldn't let her be my legal guardian, and soon I'll have to go to school, and I guess they'll send me to a children's home." Sophie's voice broke on a sob, and without thinking, Abigail pulled her into a tight embrace. "Don't you worry, sweetheart. No one is sending you anywhere. I won't let them." Sophie looked up, her eyes wet with tears, searching Abigail's face. "Really? But I'm nobody to you." 2.5 months later. Abigail opened the familiar garden gate and instantly saw Sophie and Reese, both beaming. "Well, are you ready?" Sophie was radiant. In 2 days she'd start school, and now they were leaving for Abigail's house, where they would live together. And in the spring they'd come back here, all 3 of them. "Ready," Reese echoed, her gaze soft as she looked at Abigail. "Abigail, my dear daughter, you are the brightest soul I know." Yes, Abigail had worked tirelessly to convince Reese to move in with her. The older woman simply couldn't fathom why her daughter-in-law would take on such a responsibility. And when Reese learned that Abigail was in the process of finalizing adoption paperwork to become Sophie's legal guardian, she simply wept tears of profound gratitude. On the first day of school, they stood together among all the other parents, a proud, unconventional family. Abigail watched Sophie with a swelling heart, a fierce pride blooming within her, as if the child truly were her own. Sophie, in her bright new dress, was beautiful. She was almost hidden by the enormous bouquet of colourful flowers she clutched, but in Abigail's eyes, Sophie was simply the best. And Abigail knew, with an unwavering certainty, that she would excel in everything she did. And why? The answer, of course, was simple. Because Sophie was hers. Hers. Abigail's.